Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty fascinating. It's all this talk about public funding for broadcasting here in the U.S., specifically NPR and PBS.
Right, and we've really tried to cast a wide net in terms of where we're getting our info from.
Yeah, for this one, we've got news from places like bhpioneer.com, at least the Daily Signal, FOX4 out of Dallas-Fort Worth, even the Jerusalem Post.
Oh, and we even dipped into a Reddit thread just to kind of get a feel for how the general public is reacting to all this.
Exactly. So, it's a real mix. We've got straight news opinion pieces, even some reactions from, everyday folks.
And I think what we're aiming for with this deep dive is to really give our listeners a solid grasp on why this whole topic is suddenly, under the microscope.
Yeah, why is everyone talking about this all of a sudden?
Right, we want to look at the major players who's driving this debate and what are the arguments on both sides when it comes to federal funding, for or against.
And of course, what could actually happen.
Exactly what are the potential consequences, not just for NPR and PBS, but, for us as viewers and listeners.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. The thing that really kicked off this deep dive is this hearing being held by the House subcommittee for the Department of Government Efficiency.
And the name kind of gives you a clue right off the bat.
Totally. Their whole mission seems to be about, finding and eliminating waste, fraud, abuse in government spending.
Kind of like what the DOGE initiative was trying to do back during the Trump administration.
Exactly. And the title of this hearing, which is scheduled for Wednesday, March 26, 2025, is, it's pretty telling.
Oh, yeah. What is it? Anti-American Airwaves. Holding the heads of NPR and PBS accountable.
You got it. So, right away you can see they're kind of coming at this from a particular angle.
Definitely the language itself frames NPR and PBS in almost like an adversarial position.
Yeah, and that connection back to the Trump era focus on government efficiency is interesting too. It's like a continuation of that scrutiny.
Right, but now it's zeroed in on these publicly funded media outlets that some see as leaning politically.
And the person running this subcommittee is Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, and she's been pretty vocal about why she called for this hearing.
She has, hasn't she?
Yeah, and our sources say her main issues are what she sees as a strong liberal bias in the way both NPR and PBS cover the news.
I see. So what specifically is she pointing to?
Well, she's brought up things like their reporting on that whole Hunter Biden laptop story, the origins of COVID-19, and how they handled the allegations about Russian collusion. She feels like they didn't get it right,
So she's got some specific gripes that are driving this whole scrutiny thing.
Definitely. And we know that both the NPR CEO, Catherine Maher, and PBS CEO, Paula Kerger, are scheduled to testify at this hearing.
So they'll have a chance to respond to all this directly.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they make the case for public broadcasting, given all this pushback. And the Democrats on the subcommittee, they've also invited Ed Ullman, the CEO of Alaska Public Media, to speak.
Interesting. So we'll get his perspective, too.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, Michael Gonzalez from the Heritage Foundation will be there as well.
And he's been a pretty outspoken critic of public media, hasn't he?
Yeah. So we're going to hear a pretty wide range of opinions, even though the initial framing of this hearing seems to lean in a certain direction.
It does seem that way.
And it's not just this subcommittee. Former President Trump has also made his views on NPR and PBS very clear recently.
Oh, yeah. I remember he called them a waste of money, straight up.
He did. And he even said he would be honored to defund them. His reasoning, according to our sources, is that he sees them as very biased, and he thinks there are already enough media outlets out there.
So his argument is that we don't need public broadcasting because other outlets are already covering the same ground.
Yeah, it seems like he doesn't see them as providing something unique or necessary.
Interesting. So he's essentially endorsing defunding efforts.
Yeah, if you think about it, his constant criticism of certain media throughout his presidency kind of laid the groundwork for this kind of scrutiny,
It makes you think.
It does. So let's dive into some of the arguments against federal funding that we've seen in our sources.
Okay, so what's the main one?
I think the most common one is this idea that NPR and PBS have a left-leaning bias in their political coverage.
And that's what Representative Greene and former President Trump are saying too, right?
Right. And this idea has been around for a while. It comes from certain political groups who look at the stories NPR and PBS choose to cover, how they frame those stories, who they interview.
And they see it as evidence of a particular agenda.
Exactly. Although it's tricky because what one person sees as biased, another might see as perfectly objective.
Right. It all depends on your perspective.
And then there was that whole thing back in 2023 when Elon Musk labeled NPR as state-affiliated on X. which used to be Twitter.
Oh, yeah, and later he changed it to government-funded.
Yeah, NPR pushed back pretty hard on that state-affiliated label, saying it wasn't accurate.
I can see why they'd be upset about that.
Yeah, they said it misrepresented their funding and how independent they really are.
And it kind of shows how much power these social media platforms have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if NPR disputes it, that label from Musk probably had a big impact on how some people see them.
Totally. And then we've got Michael Gonzalez from the Heritage Foundation, who's actually going to be testifying at the subcommittee hearing.
Oh, right. We mentioned him earlier.
Yeah, and he's been pretty clear about his view that public broadcasters are leftists and that defunding them would be good policy.
So he's firmly in the cut the funding camp.
He is, and he even suggested that with all the other funding they get, from members, corporate sponsors, foundation grants, and all that they should be able to do just fine without federal support.
So he's saying if people really want what NPR and PBS offer, they'll support it through those other channels.
Yeah, which is an interesting point, but it doesn't really address what might happen to smaller local stations that might not have access to as much private funding.
Right. Would they be able to survive without that federal money?
That's a big question. And conservative columnist George Will made a pretty interesting comparison. He said the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is like a vestigial organ, like the human appendix, something we don't need anymore, and that can even cause problems.
So he's basically saying the CPB has outlived its purpose.
It does seem like that's a popular argument among those who want to reduce government spending and let the market decide which media outlets thrive.
Right, but then that brings up the question of public service. Do NPR and PBS provide something valuable that goes beyond just market demand?
Okay, so let's switch gears and look at the arguments for federal funding. One of the main points we keep seeing is that it doesn't actually cost taxpayers that much, especially when you consider the quality of the programming NPR and PBS produce.
And that's programming that commercial networks might not be so interested in.
Exactly. Stuff like educational shows for kids, in-depth news coverage, cultural programs, things that might not be huge moneymakers, but are still really important for people to have access to.
Right. It's filling a gap in the media landscape.
PBS CEO Paula Kerger even gave a specific example, their new series, Carl the Collector, which is about this friendly raccoon with autism.
A raccoon with autism.
Yeah, she used it to show how public broadcasting serves a broad audience, tackles important social issues. It's part of their educational mission.
And reaching audiences that commercial media might not.
Right. And another huge argument for federal funding is the role NPR and PBS play in the emergency broadcasting system.
We don't always think about that, but it's crucial.
Yeah, during emergencies and natural disasters, that network of stations is so important for getting information out to the public.
For sure. It's a public service that goes beyond politics, to help keep people safe.
Absolutely. And our sources also pointed out how public broadcasting helps showcase different musical and cultural traditions from around the country.
It gives a platform to voices and artists that might not get attention otherwise.
Exactly. And of course, their news coverage is free for everyone to access, which is a big deal these days when so much media is behind paywalls.
Right. It's a cornerstone of an informed public.
And Paula Kerger was really strong on this point about how much rural and underserved communities depend on federal funding for their local public broadcasting stations.
Yeah, for some of those stations, federal dollars make up like 50% of their revenue.
So for them, losing that funding would be devastating.
Totally. And NPR CEO Catherine Marr, she emphasized how important their in-depth reporting is to our national discourse.
She said it would be a huge loss if that went away.
Yeah, she also talked about how crucial listener support is.
Yeah.
Because it shows Congress that people actually value public media and that the money is being used responsibly.
Right. So let's actually look at the funding breakdown to get a better understanding of how this all works. This fiscal year, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting got $535 million.
Okay, and how is that money split up?
Roughly speaking, about 3/4 goes to television, so mostly PBS, and 1/4 goes to radio, which is mostly NPR.
It's important to remember that the CPB doesn't directly fund all of NPR and PBS, right? They give grants to local public media stations, and those stations then pay fees to use the national programming from NPR and PBS.
Exactly. So it's a bit more complex than just a direct funding pipeline.
Yeah, it's important to understand that.
For NPR specifically, most of their budget, which is about $300 million a year, comes from corporate sponsors, about 36%, and fees from those member stations, about 30%. Direct federal funding only makes up about 1%. But those number stations, they often get around 8 to 10% of their funding from CPB grants. So indirectly, the federal government contributes closer to 3% of NPR's overall budget.
I see, and PBS gets a bigger chunk directly from the CPB, right?
Yeah, around 16%. And for a local station like LA's, for example, their funding from the CPB is about 4% of their budget, which is something like $1.7 million.
Wow, so there's a pretty big range in how much different organizations rely on federal funding.
Yeah, and NPR, they have a huge reach. 43 million listeners. Every week, their programming goes out through 246 member institutions, which run over 1,000 radio stations all over the country. And those stations employ about 3,000 local journalists.
So there's a pretty big operation with a lot of people working to bring us news and information at both the national and local level.
Exactly. And to add even more context, we've got Senator John Kennedy and Representative Scott Perry, who introduced this no propaganda bill, which wants to completely cut off all federal funding to the CPB.
And FCC Chairman Brendan Carr is on board with that, too. He's even looking into how NPR and PBS get their underwriting, their sponsors.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a real effort to reduce or even eliminate that federal financial support for public broadcasting.
It does, and there was also mention in our sources about some legal challenges involving international broadcasters, which just shows how much scrutiny publicly funded media in general is facing right now.
Right, and that Reddit discussion we mentioned, it's interesting because there was some confusion about how NPR's funding actually breaks down. Some people seem to underestimate how much they get from the government.
It just shows how complicated this whole thing is.
Yeah.
It's easy to get confused and have misinformation spread.
Exactly. And it's really important to have accurate information when we're having these discussions. So I think as we wrap up this deep dive, what really stands out is that the core issue is these fundamentally different views on what public media should be doing. What its value is.
Especially when it comes to NPR and PBS.
Right, and that's what's fueling all these efforts to cut their funding.
And it all comes down to that question Representative Green posed. Why should NPR and PBS ever again receive a single cent from the American taxpayer?
Yeah, and that's the big question we want our listeners to grapple with. We've laid out the information in the context. Now it's up to each person to decide what they think.
And, we've talked about funding models, arguments for and against public support, accusations of bias, concerns about losing valuable programming. There's a lot to consider.
It is. So as we finish up, here's something for everyone listening to think about, given everything we've discussed. What do you think the future of public media in the U.S. should look like?
It's a big question, but I think it's important to move beyond just the politics of it all and consider the bigger picture. What role do we want media to play in our society and how should it be supported?
Exactly. It's something worth pondering.